Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. In today's video, this topic is something that's a bit of a thorny topic for me, mainly because I didn't think I would actually be saying this at any point in my life, at least, for the next decade or so, just the way the technology has been going. But I feel like at this particular juncture, I have to bring this up. So with GPU prices just continuing to increase across the board, essentially just constantly going up and up and up, to the point where even lowly cards like the 3060 from Nvidia, which have recently released, are now climbing upwards of $800, in some cases even $900, whereas their MSRP was supposed to be closer to $300 at release. And with cards like the 3080 and 3090 now well in the $2,000 and $3,000 range, and their AMD counterparts hovering in the $1,500 to $2,000 range for the 6700 and 6800 GPUs. Again, not exactly a good showing for anybody that's trying to get into the GPU market right now. And unfortunately, of course, a lot of us are trying to get the latest GPUs to try and get a handle on better games, get better frame rates, etc. Or perhaps you're somebody who's a content creator and just needs those cards to be able to continue their workflows and get better rendering times, etc. This is now becoming a pretty big problem. Now, I do have to give Graphically Challenged here. He did a great video on this, a lot of credit given that he has done quite a fair bit of research on it, and his research mostly shows that what we're going to be seeing is a really big increase in prices even for the next generation. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that given the fact that even at the $1,500 price point that the 3090 launched at, a lot of folks were buying that card. It was sold out almost instantly, and even though you could blame it on the miners to a certain extent, what we're now seeing is that these cards, even at retailers like eBay and from other big places like Newegg and B&H Photo, etc., these cards are selling for the 3,000 and upwards price point, essentially meaning that the public is ready to pay those prices, and this sends signals to companies like AMD, even Intel, who's now coming into this whole mix, and Nvidia, that consumers are ready to pay higher pricing, essentially meaning that what we're likely to see is a generational pricing increase that we haven't seen before, to the point where we're most likely going to be seeing multiple launches of GPUs for the next gen, and possibly even refreshes that are going to be well north of $1,000 pretty much from the get-go. Now, this of course is not great news for anybody who's trying to get into gaming, and for any of us who are actively trying to upgrade their GPUs. The other problem, of course, is that mining continues to still be a hit, with seemingly showing no signs of slowing down, which of course means that until there is a crash, which I predict will happen by sometime in the summer, but there's really no way to know, we're most likely going to continue to see price hikes in these GPUs. So what does that mean for the average gamer, and what can you do at this point in time? And I think there's really only one thing that you can do if you really can't get the GPU that you want, which is that you're going to have to start streaming your games if you want the best quality. So let's take a look at a device that can let you actually do that and see what we can glean from that. So this little box in front of me is the NVIDIA Shield TV Pro. Now, this box came out roughly around 2017, so it's been a couple years on the market now, but it does also have a newer revision, which is just the tube for the new NVIDIA Shield TV. However, something that needs to be said about this is that this is a really powerful streaming device just in and of its own, using basically a modified Android TV platform, and it does pretty fantastic for streaming your shows in 1080p, 4K, what have you, to your TVs with some HDR support, as well as features like AI enhancement for those slightly lower quality videos. And this has been around for some time, and nothing in and about this is particularly new. Now, what is big about this particular device is that it does allow you to stream from multiple different sources. So if, for example, you decide to use something like Google Stadia, you can use it on the NVIDIA Shield. If you want to stream your Xbox games, you can also do that using the Xbox streaming app, which again is available in the Android store. You can also use NVIDIA's own GeForce Now streaming to stream from a PC to this device, or even from a friend's device onto this particular console or TV player, as it has become colloquially known now. And also you can do something like PlayStation Now, again giving you access to an additional amount of game streaming that you otherwise wouldn't potentially be able to do. But in addition to that, a game streaming service called Shadow will also work on the Nvidia Shield just as well, meaning that regardless of which library of games you decide to play, this little box can pretty much do it all. And with services like Shadow, you can get access to very high-end equipment to be able to play your games. Shadow supports, as far as we know right now, something like the Titan as well as a 2080 Ti as one of their top specs as far as gaming computers go, which if you don't already have one of those cards in your machine, that will be a huge boon because you're most likely going to get a boost over the current gaming PC setup that you have. Now, this also means that if you're somebody who is having a hard time getting a PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, or even S, then again, you're able to mitigate that by going to the streaming service that Xbox provides and still be able to play your games. But the bonus with using the Shield is that you're able to play all of these titles from one spot. You can choose different controllers. You can use your Xbox controller, your PlayStation controller, just about any kind of third-party controller, and anything that can plug in via the USB ports on the back as well, meaning that pretty much whatever game you decide to play, you have a choice of what kind of console you want to use, what kind of controller you want to be able to play on, which again is a huge benefit because you are able to take full advantage of the control schemes that are pertinent to said title without having to feel like you're being shoehorned into using a whole different setup. Now, of course, there are drawbacks with this particular kind of setup, which is that of course, it's only limited to a gigabit connection, and that's provided that your house connection is able to actually keep up with such speeds at all. In my particular instance, I only have a 250 megabit connection to my house, which is not exactly particularly fast. And during peak hours, when most people are starting to watch their Netflix and HBO, etc., it also means that my bandwidth is only going to increase that much more, and I'm also going to see significant amount of latency. Now, I can pay for a gig connection to my house, but that is about $400 a month, and at that point it really kind of negates, me having that kind of connection, because in a couple of months I could essentially buy a GPU if I wanted to, and that is not really something that I plan on doing. However, if you live in an area where your connection is really stable, then this just might be the solution here. And the reason why I say this, despite really hating streaming in general, being a PC gamer, I've always loved building my own PCs and having a powerful computer locally for minimum amounts of latency, among other reasons as well. But with these setups, you are again able to access a huge library of titles without having to have a huge loud machine sitting around in your house. You're not having to pay ridiculous amounts of money for different hardware. It doesn't take up a whole lot of space. And at the end of the day, you can take this to a friend's house, whatever. If you're traveling somewhere, you're getting an Airbnb. Again, provided there's a decent connection involved, you can play all of the games that you would normally play on your home console or PC, all from this little device. And given that the GPU prices don't seem to be slowing down anytime soon, at least as I think until the summer, it's very likely that this will be the best kind of way to gain access to your games at not only high frame rates, but also potentially at a very cost manageable kind of way. Because again, the consoles right now are still really expensive. People are scalping them on eBay, they're scalping them on places like Mercari, and any other kind of seller marketplaces that are available, which essentially just means that you're going to be having a hard time getting a console that you want at a price point that is reasonable. Now, with that said, this device is by no means perfect. Obviously, you're still going to experience latency, and playing first-person games that are competitive, or anything in the likes of Overwatch, Apex Legends, Fortnite, what have you, PUBG, anything where basically input latency is going to make the difference between you actually winning the match or being somewhere in the middle. This again is probably not going to be the best choice for those kinds of titles, meaning that you really will have to invest in a better GPU just to take advantage of that. However, it will depend on the service that you're using, as if you're using a Shadow like service where you're essentially having access to a full-on PC and you live close enough to one of their centers where they host these machines, then your latency may not necessarily be so bad and can potentially be rather manageable overall to let you play such titles. But the benefit again with the NVIDIA Shield is that you have access to a whole multitude of services that may not necessarily work on other Android TVs that are out there. There are a lot of different setups that exist. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different Android TV setups that are currently on the market, and not all of them necessarily have the specs that this particular unit has, and they may not necessarily support the services that I mentioned earlier in the video, meaning that you may not necessarily get the full benefit of using a streaming service over an Android TV type setup. Now, of course, you could go for something like a Nook, where you basically have a mini PC that allows you to gain access to a lot of these services in a similar way as an NVIDIA Shield, but that's going to cost you a lot of money. I picked this unit up for approximately $175, which I think is pretty reasonable, all things considered, and it allows me again to access a full library of games across multiple different console ecosystems, as well as PC titles that otherwise I would not be able to run at anywhere near the same kind of frame rates or with the same graphical options that I would using something like Shadow. Now, with that said, is this the ultimate solution? Are there different kind of streaming solutions out there? Of course, there are many different types out there, but I think as an all-in-one type unit, you really can't beat the NVIDIA Shield. You can see lots of videos of people gaming on this, streaming all kinds of different services through this little box, and they all work pretty much flawlessly, again, provided that your internet connection does pretty well. Now, looking to the future, I think that streaming will become even more and more popular, especially as we see GPU prices and even CPUs nowadays kind of continue to climb up and creep up in price over time, especially now given that inflation is kind of rampant. It is very likely that GPU prices again are only going to soar, and that only means bad things for us gamers, whereas systems like this, typically have already been manufactured. There are a lot of them out there, so they're not subject to the same price hikes that you would typically see of modern silicon. So you'll be able to pick these up for a relatively cheap price, although again, I think the NVIDIA Shield is definitely going to be the better option out of the multitude that are available out there to you right now. Again, just because of the compatibility that it has with different kind of streaming platforms that exist today. Now, the streaming platforms, of course, do mean that you have to pay an additional subscription cost on top of whatever internet that you're already paying for, as well as this device. And it will depend on you whether or not this is something that is ultimately worth it to you. However, you do have to remember that with services like PlayStation Plus and Xbox Game Pass, you are able to get all of the games without having to necessarily pay the 60, 70, whatever dollar amount it would normally be, because you're able to access them through these services. So if you already pay the subscription for those specific services, then again, this only makes a whole lot more sense for you to have, especially if, for example, say your Xbox or PlayStation died. This will be a much cheaper alternative to gain access to the same library of games you had before, and even newer titles, and not have to pay full price, as you will be able to be on a subscription model. And if it's a game that you don't like, you can simply move on to something else because you don't actually have to download it to your console, which means you get access to it right away. And this is huge news because, again, that means that if you live in an area like myself where a lot of people are accessing the internet during these sort of peak hours, then you may have very slow download times. Whereas using something like this, so long as you have enough bandwidth to run, a 1080p connection, what have you, to be able to stream that kind of bitrate video, then you are completely fine, and you may just experience a tad bit of latency, but again, depending on the titles you play, it may not matter as much, especially if the games that you play are mainly single-player adventure titles, third-person shooters that don't necessarily rely on having an internet connection because you have to have some kind of multiplayer mode. So anything single-player is generally going to be just fine for you. But playing games like Destiny, again, Apex Legends, PUBG, any of the more competitive titles, Call of Duty, may have a significant impact in terms of your perceived kind of fluidity of the game, and also just being able to get consistent shots downrange, as those titles are, of course, going to be much more impacted by the latency that you see from devices like this and from streaming platforms just pretty much across the board. But with that said, again, you have to consider the fact that even when you add up the subscription services from PlayStation Plus, Xbox with their Game Pass service, something like Shadow as well, if you just want to play PC games, then at the end of the day, it still comes in under what you would pay for one of these GPUs, and with a huge access of different games that you otherwise may not have bought or would have to set aside additional money for just to be able to game. So given that this little unit does so much, I think right now for gamers it is one of the best times to get into streaming, and probably this will be a point in time that streaming really does take off to a level that we haven't seen it before. Previously, there really was no real reason to go with a streaming service unless, again, you happen to be traveling a lot and couldn't take your console or PC with you, or you had some other reason such as space constraints in your house that prevented you from getting a PC set up. Then again, these services were pretty much a boon. But given how much we have seen in terms of the explosion of prices across just all kinds of PC hardware, from CPUs to GPUs, and even nowadays some RAM pricing increasing, again due to the strain on the foundries, I think that this is the alternative that you really have no choice but to kind of accept at this point in time, unless you just really don't want to play your games at higher frame rates, or you don't want to see that quality that we've all, as PC gamers at least, have come to expect. But really, the alternatives are pretty slim, and there's not a whole lot that you can do given the current market right now. So I think streaming is going to be the thing that really saves sort of gaming during this time frame, and at least for a year into the future, because it's very likely that foundries are not going to be able to recover until that time to get us the volume that we need to really start pushing GPUs back. Now, like I said, depending on where mining ends up, we may see some used GPUs hit the market, which means we could have potential price drops. But I would suspect at this point in time that even when we do see mining take a hit, again, due to inflation and due to the fact that there's so much demand, especially after the mining craze ends, we're still going to see a pretty huge demand in number of people that are going to be snatching up these cards. I think you're still going to be paying MSRP pricing, and probably not lower, for these GPUs despite the fact that they're used, which means that even if you've been saving up for a while, you should expect to probably pay very close to original sticker price on these GPUs, and also possibly even CPUs, moving into an area where we see mining kind of take a hit. But I wouldn't really count on this happening sometime soon. It is still most likely months out before we do see that dip, meaning that, again, if you want to play your games and you want to have a kind of top-notch experience, streaming really is the only option for you available right now that doesn't take as much of a hit to your bank account, and ultimately allows you to access all the games that you would have otherwise, again, had to pay for or may not have necessarily picked up. So hopefully this video gives you guys a bit of an explainer on what's happening, and gives you kind of an idea of what the NVIDIA Shield is capable of. Now, there are better videos out there that show you the full potential of this little device, but again, I just wanted to get some information out there so that you guys can have additional options to take a look at in terms of being able to play your games, stream your movies, etc. This is kind of the all-in-one device that will allow you to do all of those things. So stick around. I'm going to try and see if I can get some videos up in terms of, actually streaming, and see what the performance is like with my crappy connection, because most likely yours will be a lot better, and we'll see how it does, especially compared against what I see on my PC. So see you guys in the next video, and enjoy until then.